coming. This is our second to last PolyConnect Live of the year. And thank you to Alex Wyman, class of 2005, to be here, for being here today to talk to you guys about his work as a U.S. Department of Justice, as an attorney, and his path from Poly. So.
Thanks, Catherine, and thank you guys for having me. I'll say it's a real honor to be back at Poly. I have so many fond memories here, and it was such a privilege to go to the school that I hope you all are enjoying it as much as I did. As Catherine mentioned, I'm here today to talk to you about what I do for a living, which is I am an assistant United States attorney. At a high level, what that means is that I'm a federal prosecutor. Some of you probably know what a prosecutor is, either from TV or from people you may know in the industry, and you're probably thinking of a district attorney. You may have read about it in the news. There was an election yesterday for, or at least a primary, to replace the district attorney. That is the state version of what I do. So there are state prosecutors, known as the district attorney and deputy district attorney, and they prosecute state crimes, which are everything from robbery to murder to petty theft and the like. I work not for the state of California, but for the United States government. And so we prosecute federal crimes, which there is some overlap with state, but we tend to do much larger cases and in the field of what I do, which is white collar crime, more sophisticated, high dollar, more high profile type fraud cases. Part of the reason for that is just volume. For the 7 counties surrounding Los Angeles, it's kind of going up north to San Luis Obispo, east to San Bernardino, and south through Orange County. There are only 180 federal prosecutors. That's my district. Compare that with thousands of deputy district attorneys in that same geographic region. And specifically for what I do, which is white collar crime, there are only 25 of us who specialize in that. So there are really, we don't have the resources to go after, petty theft or anything below a certain dollar threshold when it comes to white collar crime. So I'll talk a little bit more about what I do on a day-to-day basis a little bit later. But first, I was asked to talk to you about my trajectory to where I am now after leaving Poly. So with that in mind, as Catherine mentioned, I was Poly class of 2005. I was a lifer here, so I spent 14 years from pre-K all the way through 12th grade. I then went to Princeton, where I graduated in 2009, and then law school at the University of Virginia. Law school, some of you may be thinking about it, some of you may have heard about what it's like. Every generation sort of has its own, references about what law school is like. When I was growing up and in high school, my parents and everyone in that generation referred to this sort of arcane movie called The Paper Chase, which is about how awful it is and how grueling being a first-year student is at Harvard Law School. You're all way too young to have seen this movie, and it's really boring, so I wouldn't recommend it. My generation kind of based it. Our reference was Legally Blonde, which I'm afraid that you might even be too young for that. So the best I could do for a more recent reference was Meghan Markle in Suits. I don't know if you've seen it, but that was the best I could do. Law school is grueling. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of reading. It's a lot of pressure, especially your first year. That said, there are a million things you can do with a law degree. It's a very valuable education. I would highly recommend it. We could do a whole other talk on just the values of law school. But in general, when you're in law school, you want to decide, generally what you want to do after law school. And if you decide, as most people do, that you want to actually be a practicing lawyer, there are 2 sort of tracks to go in. One's what they call litigation, and then one's transactional law. The difference at a high level is litigators are what you think about on TV, people who go to court and argue in front of a judge or a jury. That's called litigation. Transactional lawyers are lawyers who advise companies on transactions, on deals. So they may work with an investment bank to advise a company on a merger or acquisition, for example. That's kind of the transactional path. I decided when I was in law school that I wanted to be a litigator, and that specifically I wanted to be a trial lawyer. That I wanted to, go to court and try cases in front of a jury. It felt to me then, and having done a number of jury trials now, it feels to me now to be the sort of epitome of the legal profession. And so to do that, I had to figure out, what path to take after law school. And you could go be a trial lawyer if you go to like a mom and pop small law firm and take any case that comes in through the door, but you're going to sacrifice the quality of work that you'll be doing. And so what I was told is if you want to be a trial lawyer, early on in your career, if you want to know what it's really like to try cases and do really high quality work, you should go to the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is what I set out to do. The problem is it's extremely competitive and difficult to get there. We have thousands of applications and very few spots. And so, I left law school with a goal toward getting myself to where I am now at the U.S. Attorney's Office. So the first thing I did after leaving law school was I clerked for a federal judge. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but I would highly recommend it. It was the best experience I think you can have as a young lawyer. Then I went to a law firm here in LA called Melvin & Myers for a couple of years. And after that, I kind of had enough experience at that point to apply, and was fortunate enough to get an offer where I am now. But I want to talk about my clerkship first, but to give you a very brief primer on the way that the court systems work so you understand it. You have, there's the bottom level in both the federal system and the state is called the trial court. That's where all trials are held. If you have a jury trial or what they call a bench trial before a judge, it's going to be held at the trial level, either the federal district court level or the state trial court level. Then there's an intermediate court of appeals in both the state and federal system. That all they do is they review decisions made by the trial judge. They don't hold any trials of their own. They just review decisions by the lower court. Then there is, on the state side, a state Supreme Court that reviews decisions made by the appellate courts, and those can ultimately be reviewed by the U.S. Supreme Court, and so can decisions by the U.S. Courts of Appeals. Knowing that I wanted to be a trial lawyer, I was most interested in clerking for a judge at the trial court level. And just practically speaking, federal judges get way more interesting and more sophisticated cases than the state, and you'll have a much more valuable experience on the federal side. So I clerked for Judge Beverly Reed O'Connell, who is a federal district court judge here in Los Angeles. As a clerk, you're right out of law school, and you have way too much power for your experience at that time. You help research and write judicial orders, advise the judge on trial rulings, and you watch a lot of trials, which is why I was really interested in it. But I would say this experience, if you're interested in being a lawyer, is the best you can have, in part because you learn about how to litigate, but in part because you have a mentor. Judge O'Connell was an incredible mentor to me, and you really can't replace that experience. So then I went from there to a law firm, which is commonly known as big law. They're these large law firms that they are very lucrative. You get paid a lot of money, but there are some downsides. And so I figured I would talk briefly about the sort of pros and cons. As I said, you get paid a lot of money, and you get interesting cases at the better firms, high quality work. You work with high quality lawyers, and the format of how they train you to become a lawyer is sort of the apprenticeship model. You learn by helping others to do the more kind of substantive work, and the idea is that you learn by helping them. The upshot of that, of course, is you don't do any of it yourself for a long time, which is why I wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. You also have very long hours. You work a ton, very unpredictable schedule because you're always kind of on the partner you're working for schedule or the clients. Sometimes you have unsavory clients. You don't get to pick your clients. You have very demanding people that you work for. And as I said, you never get to see the inside of a courtroom. So if you want to actually get real courtroom experience, then you come to the U.S. Attorney's Office. The single coolest thing about my job is that every time I go to court, I stand up in front of the judge and I say, Alex Wyman on behalf of the United States. That never gets old, and I don't think it ever will get old to know that I'm there in federal court representing the United States of America. Whatever your politics, whatever you feel about, country or government, is always a cool feeling to know that you're there to represent the United States. There are also a number of other great things about it. You get a ton of responsibility. I have all my own cases. People don't tell me what to do. I have tons of discretion in how I prosecute cases. My cases are all very interesting because I basically get to choose them. You get a lot of trial experience, as I mentioned, and I work with great people, and we have the best mission you can imagine, which is literally our job description is just to do justice. And as corny as that sounds, what that means is I always have to think about what the right thing to do would be in a given situation and then go do that. That's it. And then lastly, we work with, on a daily basis with special agents of a number of agencies, most commonly the FBI. And they're great people. It's kind of a unique partnership that we have with law enforcement agencies. Of course, the major downside to my job, which I put in very small font, is that we get paid very little compared to big law firms. All right, so in my office now, we have a number of different sections. The biggest ones are general crimes. That's where all the rookies go. So my first year in the office, I was in general crimes. I prosecuted everything from drug crimes to violent crimes to smaller fraud cases. And then there's major frauds, which is the section I'm in, which is the sort of white collar, larger corporate healthcare securities fraud cases. Public corruption, which, if there's a corrupt politician, or they also do civil rights cases, so like police brutality, we'll prosecute like police officers, for example. Violent organized crime, they do large gang cases involving, the Mexican mafia, or big gangs you may have heard about in the past. If you watch Narcos, my office actually prosecuted everyone who killed Kiki Camarena. That was obviously years ago. Then there's the international narcotics, money laundering, and racketeering section, which is the larger sort of drug section. And then smaller sections, asset forfeiture, appeals, and environmental. So in my section, the white collar cases we do, I want to walk you through just a few of the kind of common types of cases that I do on a daily basis. One example is a Ponzi scheme. This is Bernie Madoff. You've probably heard of him. He conducted the largest Ponzi scheme in history. I think it was north of $20 billion in losses to his investors. That's obviously a once in a multi-generation case. Those come up very, very rarely. But we do have Ponzi schemes way more often than you would believe. I recently just had a Ponzi scheme case against a CPA, an accountant named Carol Pedersen, who collected $40 million from her best friends and clients, and then just took it all herself or paid it back in what they call Ponzi payments to keep the fraud going. That was a case I recently prosecuted, and she was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, which is a real sentence. It's hard to know at your level what relative what sentences are, but people who commit serious frauds like that get serious sentences. Another common type of case is an insider trading case. I'm going to trial in April against a defendant named Mark Lohman for committing insider trading. He's charged with placing trades in the stock market on what they call material non-public information. That basically means information about a company that is important and not known to the investing public. That's a crime. He's going to trial, as I said, in April, but this is another kind of common white-collar case. Another common case we do a lot of it is healthcare fraud. I'm going to trial in October against individuals associated with this company that, if you were in your 30s or older, you probably remember 1-800-GET-THIN. They've had billboards all over Southern California. They had a radio jingle called where they said, "Let your new life begin," called 1-800-GET-THIN. They advertise these lap band surgeries, which are incredibly invasive and dangerous, as a means of basically losing weight. And we have charged them with defrauding insurance companies related to providing these surgeries. And as I said, that's set for trial in October. Apart from these sort of more common white-collar cases, what I love about my job is that there is a lot of conduct out there that seems criminal and isn't already being prosecuted by a district attorney, for example, but maybe should be. And so we get to take a look at that and figure out whether we can and should prosecute it as a crime. And so I wanted to highlight a couple of examples of that, one of which I'm sure you are familiar with. Varsity Blues. I'm guessing you're all familiar with the college admissions scandal that came to light last March. So most of these defendants, the case is being prosecuted out of the Boston U.S. Attorney's Office, but a lot of the defendants charged in the case, parents and other school officials, are based here in LA. And so the way it works when there's a large arrest, like they had in this case, I think they arrested over 30-some people on that day, they contact the prosecutors in that district to help handle the arrests and then the initial hearing. And so I handled the detention hearings for Lori Laughlin, Massimo, Felicity Huffman, and a number of, and basically there were I think 17 people in the LA area. And so another assistant U.S. attorney and I basically split them up, and we had to handle all those hearings over a couple of days, and it was very interesting, not only because of all the press that was involved, but because it was something until at that point people didn't really think of as a crime. It was in the sort of gray area. Now, of course, some of it is more typically black and white crime, like forging or changing the test scores. But the donations aspect of it seemed to fall in more of a gray area, which makes the case pretty interesting. It's an ongoing case, so I'm not going to comment on the merits of it, but that's an example of the type of case that we sometimes charge in a more creative way. And the way it was charged here was honest services fraud. It was charged as a racketeering conspiracy to commit honest services fraud, and basically that means that's like a bribery or a kickback scheme. Another example is a trial I just finished in October involving a guy named Ali El Mazayan. He was the defendant in that case. He, in April 2015, drove a car over the side of the Port of Los Angeles into the water with his ex-wife and their 2 young disabled children in the back seat. He immediately swam out of the car, he left his window open and swam to safety and left his ex-wife and children to drown. The ex-wife survived, even though she didn't know how to swim, because the fisherman threw her a life raft and the children died. He said it was an accident, and the LAPD and district attorney investigated for a while, decided they couldn't prove that it wasn't an accident, even though it later came to light, before they declined their charges, that he had taken out life insurance policies with 8 different companies, insuring his family's lives for the tune of $7 million. After the district attorney declined to bring that case, we picked it up. My friend and I in the office decided to investigate it from the angle of insurance fraud. The theory being that he defrauded insurance companies by saying they died in an accident to collect on the insurance proceeds, when in fact it was not an accident. He intentionally killed them. And so the theory of the fraud was he murdered them and then lied about murdering them. And so we had to essentially prove that he murdered them at trial, which we did. And as a result, he was convicted on all counts and is going to be sentenced next month. He is, not sure what his sentencing will be. It is likely that he will get over 200 years, essentially a life sentence. That's another example of the kind of discretion and creativity that we get to have in this office, where the DA decides not to bring this case, but we decide to move forward with it. So the worst thing about being at AUSA is that, well, not worst thing, but one of the hard things about being a trial lawyer in federal court is they don't allow cameras, and so that's supposed to be me from that trial. This was what the sketch artist did. Obviously it looks nothing like me. Another downside is I didn't dress up for this meeting. I have to wear this every day. But all that said, it's an incredibly interesting, rewarding, and exciting job that I love, and would recommend it to anyone with an interest in being a trial lawyer. So I know we are in time.
That's perfect timing. Any questions?
So, questions?
Just to clarify, so when does a case get passed on, from the district attorney's office to your office? What is the process where the district attorney decides to pass it on to y'all?
Sure, there's no formal process. I will say practically speaking, if it's a large case, the local enforcement agency like LAPD will probably say this is better suited for federal prosecution. Sometimes they do big cases in the state, but more often than not, especially when it's like a drug case or a white collar case, if it's large, the local police officers will, or the district attorney will say this is better suited for federal prosecution, and they'll call the FBI or they'll call my office. So it's kind of informal. Yeah.
How does politics affect your job?
That's a good question. How do politics affect my job? Or most of the time, it doesn't at all. We are, I don't know how much you've read about this in the news recently, maybe that prompted your question, but a couple of weeks ago, there was some controversy about the president basically tweeting about an ongoing case that was brought by a different U.S. Attorney's Office, one in D.C., and that there was speculation that affected the sentencing recommendation. That has never happened to me. For the most part, we are sort of, while I work for the Department of Justice, which is headed by the Attorney General, who's appointed by the President, in the 94 districts around the country, each U.S. attorney has pretty broad discretion and control. So I've never felt like politics affects my job at all. That said, who knows? But it has never affected my job.
Yeah, so like you're saying appointments, though, doesn't that affect it then?
Appointments?
Yeah, because if the president appoints somebody, then they go through the process of appointing people below them as well.
Sort of. So the only politically appointed person in my office is the U.S. attorney. Everyone else, including the first assistant, which is like the second in command, and the deputies below, are all what we call line prosecutors. Like mine's a career position. I can stay there forever. And that's how people get promoted up within. There's only one political appointee, and our U.S. attorney is fantastic. Anyone else? Yeah.
I think it was interesting that you mentioned your prosecution of the Varsity Blues scandal and how it was sort of a gray area in crime. And so my question is about how you reconcile things that you think perhaps are crimes and you can choose to prosecute them, or perhaps on the flip side of that, laws that you might perceive as unjust. So there's been a lot of conversation about mass incarceration and that sort of thing with the current drug laws and your enforcement of laws that you might disagree with. So how do you reconcile that sort of tension?
So I think there are a couple questions there. One is how do we decide whether to prosecute something that isn't being prosecuted yet? I think part of that is looking at what sort of regulatory enforcements already exist for regulating that conduct. Sometimes we may feel like it's already managed by some state regulatory body, and it's not worth bringing the hammer of criminal prosecution. Other times we may decide, this is really egregious conduct, it's worthy of our attention. Trying to think of an example I can actually share. I don't know that I have one, but it's essentially we have to look at the conduct and whether we think it's worthy of saying this is a crime and you could go to prison for it. Separately on the sort of mass incarceration issue and drug crimes, there's that's obviously well above my pay grade. The over-incarceration issues are primarily a state issue. The federal prisons are a separate system and don't have the same problems that California has in the state system. But obviously, you mentioned the long sentences for drug crimes. Those are they're very long, and I think there's been recent legislation that's supposed to address that, and there may be more in the future, but we are kind of bound to follow what the statutes are. Anyone else? No, don't be shy. I don't know how much time we have. No.
What kind of advice would you give these guys?
Sure.
Actually, how many are juniors and seniors in here? Seniors? As they start to think
my advice generally, I mean, is just to go for every opportunity you have. I went through the jobs I had after law school, and I wasn't like really qualified for any of them. And I was like putting this together. I was like, wow, that like looks way more impressive than I've ever felt, because I felt like it was a stretch applying for every school I applied for, every job I'd had, and I wouldn't have had the career I've had or be where I am today if I was afraid of rejection. Or putting myself out there, kind of out of my comfort zone. I actually hated talking in public. I was in school, I always sat in the back and never participated in class. I wasn't comfortable with it. But I knew, like, I just thought being a trial lawyer would be like cool and what I would enjoy. And I sort of forced myself out of my comfort zone. And as a result, I'm much more comfortable now. I'm in a much better place professionally than I would have been if I didn't take those chances or kind of put myself out there. Yeah.
Has your job ever caused you to, like, has it changed your view on, like, humanity at all?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I think, it's hard not to be a little bit saddened by, I mean, the first thing I noticed when I joined the office was that, like, there's like crime everywhere. I mean, it really is, it's just so much more prevalent than I realized when you're kind of out. I was in a bubble, I went to Poly, I grew up in Pasadena, I went to great schools. I didn't really have exposure to the world I now see every day. And so it is hard to, it's hard not to feel a little bit skeptical from that perspective. But on the other side, once we convict a defendant, they get sentenced. And as part of the sentencing process, I always see the human side of them. Their attorneys put together, all the information that makes them more sympathetic. It's called, presenting mitigation. And that always helps you realize that they're just people. I think the single most interesting experience that I've had in this job is anytime I do a proffer session, which is where I meet with a defendant who has decided to cooperate and provide information to us, and I'll sit like this close to him or her and talk to them about their crimes, but also about like how they got there. And it's a fascinating experience because, as I said, I grew up in a bubble where I didn't know anyone like this, and you have really long conversations with these people, and you learn that they're just a lot of times they're people who made bad decisions or grew up in a bad environment. And anyway, I think it has changed my view, but not particularly one way or the other. I'd say it's more sort of expanded my view.
Thank you so much.